Welcome back, everybody. It's time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. We dip back into the DC production office history with Anthony Tollin in a two-part conversation today because Anthony has worn many hats in his career in genre fiction. Again, he was part of the production office of DC as a letterer. His wonderful wife, the late, great Adrienne Roy, was a highly valued colorist back in her prime during her career, and Anthony has lovingly kept her memory alive with wonderful photographs that he posts on social media every now and then. This was a conversation we had back in 2013, and I did want to talk to Anthony because he was also making great recreations of old pulp magazines in softcover form, especially representing the adventures of Doc Savage and the Shadow. You know, the forerunners of the great runs of superheroes, debuting about 7 or 8 years before the debut of Superman, and very much, I think, part of the ideas that came into Superman, the Fortress of Solitude from Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, the Shadow, obviously a man of mystery who, at times when DC has had the Shadow license, has incorporated him in the backstory of Batman. And we certainly know that the likelihood that Bob Kane and Bill Finger, when creating Batman, were thinking about a lot of the elements of Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, in creating Bruce Wayne and Batman. So not only that, but you really will get some great inside stories about how Teen Titans became the hit that it was, with Wolfman and Perez doing the art chores and the writing, and Adrienne Roy doing the coloring. Lots of really interesting stuff. And we also talk about the fact that certainly, and this is back in 2013, when cost-cutting started to happen in comics, and unfortunately the first line of that, in terms of dealing with less money, was the production department, the letterers, the colorists and stuff. So lots of really great stuff. It's a two-part conversation. I will be presenting it in two parts. This is part one today on Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners, my producers, if you will, because they give me the funds to keep Word Balloon going via Patreon at patreon.com. If you like the show and want to help out, it would be greatly appreciated. I'm not asking you to break the bank. Can you spare the price of a comic book a month? Even $1 a month would really help me out and keep things going. You know, I've expanded Word Balloon the last couple years to be an almost daily podcast and provide a really great look into pop culture. And that is because I get great help from the League of Word Balloon listeners. Again, if you could help out, it would be greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you very much for your great support, the League of Word Balloon listeners. Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenanti's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenanti's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534. We're going to switch over to the DC production side of things with a conversation with Anthony Tollin. Now, Anthony, I first became aware of Anthony from his wonderful essays on pulp characters like the Shadow in, I believe, the DC run of the Shadow back in the 70s that Denny O'Neil was writing, and Mike Kaluta started drawing, but also Frank Robbins and I want to say Ernie Cruz was the final artist on that run. But occasionally we'd get essays from Anthony about the Shadow. He was a huge pulp fan. He continued that love moving on to old-time radio and really, got to express his fandom in essays about some of the great old radio shows, and I'm a big fan of that stuff. And nowadays, Anthony is publishing the Shadow and Doc Savage pulp novels through his own company. Go to theshadowsanctum.com, and you'll find in the pulp section Doc Savage, The Shadow, Nick Carter, Master Detective, The Phantom Detective, The Avenger, and The Whisperer. Anthony does a great job of not only representing the pulps, but as I said earlier about his DC run, essays about the characters as well, written by some really great historians, Will Murray, Harlan Ellison, Anthony himself. Really great stuff and a great representation of a lot of great pulp heroes. And as we know, the pulp heroes are the building blocks from where the superheroes came from. But nice conversation with Anthony Tollin right now on Word Balloon. Anthony Tollin, thank you for coming on. Welcome to Word Balloon, sir.
Glad to be here.
Man, I'll tell you, you've had a very interesting career. I love what you're currently doing, and certainly am interested in your past career as a comic book colorist. Is that fair to say? Do you still color comics, or
no? It's past career. I've been lucky enough to, through my entire adult life, to trick people into paying me to do my hobbies, and that included 21 years at DC Comics and shorter periods at Warner and Marvel and Disney, and then I spent about a dozen years writing historical booklets on radio drama and comedy. For radio.
That stuff's up my alley as well, sir. I'm a big pulp fan and an old-time radio fan,
and I also scripted a syndicated radio show hosted by Stan Freberg called When Radio Was for 6 years.
I was an avid listener, sir. I'm here in Chicago, and WBBM is one of those affiliates that carried the show when Stan was hosting. And no, that was a great show, man. Well, first I want to talk about coloring because I'm a radio broadcaster as well, and as I'm sure you're familiar, I come from the era of analog tape and razor blades and China markers and splicing tape.
And similarly, I come from the comic book era of rubber cement and rubber cement thinner and T-squares. And
were those the tools of the trade for a colorist back then?
Well, no, I started as I started as head proofreader at DC. I'd been assistant editor at Warren before, and I'd done paste up and production at Marvel. But I was head proofreader for a year and a half or so, and then I was a production artist for 6 months or so, and then I became assistant production manager in charge of all color. And then later, after 7.5 years on staff, I went freelance. And I was lucky enough to work in the business, to get into comics at a time when I got to work with my childhood idols, with the Kurt Swans and Julie Schwartzes and Kurt Schaffenbergers and Gil Kanes. And Carmen Infantino was president of DC Comics at that time. And my two immediate bosses, Jack Adler and Saul Harrison, had both worked on the color separations on Action Comics #1. And in fact, Saul Harrison had operated the binding machine that for the first comic book ever published, Famous Funnies #1.
Wow.
So, and then, we had people, Bob Oxner was still at DC, who started in the business, I think, in 1939, and Jack Kirby, of course. Joe Simon and Joe Kubert were both editors at DC when I started there. And so it was just a wonderful time. I'd worked briefly at Marvel, and I hadn't been terribly happy there because almost everyone at that time had only been there for, a year or two. And at DC, there were people who would mentor you and train you, who, knew the business and you could really learn from. And, Julie Schwartz, who, co-published the first science fiction fanzines back in 1930 and had been an editor at DC since 1944 and had been, Ray Bradbury's first agent. So it was just a wonderful time. I was part of the Junior Woodchucks, as we called ourselves.
Explain that. Absolutely. I'm aware of that group, but let the listeners know. Fantastic.
Well, basically, Saul Harrison realized, because of the Comics Code and the entrenchment of the comic book field, the contraction in the 1950s with the Comics Code, there really hadn't been any new talent in the comics business, very little at least, since the EC era. So we'd really gone for 20 years with no one new. I mean, there were a few people in the 60s, Roy Thomas and Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams and Jim Steranko and Gary Friedrich, and then Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta and Len Wein and Marv Wolfman. But in 1973, Saul Harrison became quite aware that most of DC staffers were in their late 50s or so, and that they really needed to start training their successors, and so they recruited a group of new talent. Pat Broderick as a staff artist, Martin Pascoe as a staff writer, Paul Levitz as an assistant editor, Bob Brzakis, Guy H. Lillian, later Jack C. Harris, Alan Asherman, Carl Gafford, and myself in production, and also Steve Mitchell at times. And, we were really trained and mentored to eventually take over these positions. And the comic book industry at that time has been kind of compared, the younger generation at least, to kind of the Parisian literary circles of the 1920s. Because there was, this influx of young, new talent. And we socialized together and partied together, and it was, at that time you had to live in New York or close to New York to work in the business. This was before the days of FedEx. And I mean, Jack Kirby had recently moved to the West Coast, but it was still, pretty unheard of. And so, by and large, we were a group of young transplants from the Midwest or elsewhere, all working our dream jobs, and we were all, pretty much brimming with enthusiasm. Here's our chance to do what we love doing. It was in some ways comparable. Certainly we weren't creating a new art form like the Jerry Robinsons and Mort Meskins and Lou Fines and Will Eisners had done in the late 30s. But we were a generation of young people who was coming into this field all at the same time. And, there wasn't a progression. There were very few people in the business who were in their 30s at that time. As I said, Roy Thomas, Len Wein, Neil Adams, et cetera, but quite few. And so it was pretty much either people in their 50s or even 60s and us in our early 20s. So, we tended to pal around a lot, and, most of us were from out of town. I was living in a $200 a month studio apartment in Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, 10-minute walk from Rockefeller Center. And it was just a wonderful, exciting time. We were all doing what we wanted to do. And we'd all, I guess, to some degree. I remember there was a Warner, we were part of Warner Communications, and there was a Warner young, Warner Junior executive or something by the elevator one day, and I heard him mentioning that, Manhattan and Los Angeles were filled with people with transplants who had not been happy in high school. And actually, I'd been fairly happy in high school, but people who wanted something, if you really enjoyed high school, you married your high school sweetheart and, got a job as an insurance salesman and stayed in the town you grew up in. And there were certain people who wanted something more. And I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous when I look back at it. It's kind of like, the bumblebee who shouldn't be able to fly, but nobody told the bumblebee. There was no way I should have been able to, with $1,000 saved, move to Manhattan and 2.5 weeks later be working as assistant editor of Creepy Eerie, Vampirella, and Famous Monsters of Filmland. But, I had more ambition probably than talent, but I was a hard worker and I was willing to work harder. than virtually anyone. And I probably came a year or two before my talents were ready, but I was able, to get in the door. A friend of mine, Ray Erlenborn, who was a sound effects man at CBS for decades, going back to the 30s, talked about the important thing being knowing enough that you can fake your way into getting hired and then learning the job in the first week or two. And, there's something to be said for that. And, but suddenly, I was 22 years old and sitting in the Warner Brothers cafeteria with, Murphy Anderson and Sergio Aragones and, Joe Orlando and people. And I was there, because I was one of the guys they worked with. And this was, pretty much a dream for a 22-year-old fanboy.
That's terrific. Yeah, go on, please.
But, we had, but yeah, there were all these, well, as I said, it was the age of Kurt Swan and Kurt Schaffenberger, and Dick Dillon was drawing Justice League, and Julie Schwartz was, still there editing Superman and Batman and Justice League and Green Lantern when I started.
Okay.
Murray Boltinoff, who'd been there since 43, or even before. And Joe Kubert was still an editor. He was doing Tarzan and Our Army at War and, Tarzan Family Correct. And
gotcha.
So it was just a great time. And there was this, enthusiasm. And then things started changing. Carmine Infantino was forced out, and Jeanette Kahn was brought in. And
as publisher. Yeah.
As publisher. And that actually, Jeanette came in, and she had come in from other areas of publishing and realized you couldn't necessarily treat talent the way that, publishers had back in the pulp era. And, rates started going up and talent started being treated better. I started at DC when, coloring rates were $4 or $5 a page for interior pages.
Wow.
And
how big were the comics back then? How many pages?
Well, no, we colored. We colored them the size of the printed book. We colored stats, and this was not separations. This was just painting in aniline-based watercolor, Dr. Martin's dyes, and but we started at $4 or $5 a page, and at that time I think writers were getting $10 or $15 a page. And when I left coloring, my rate at DC was $34 for regular books or $44 for Baxter Comics.
Okay.
And this was, before the days of computer separation. So generally a page was, no more than an hour's work. And we were, and thanks to Jeanette and Paul Levitz and the changes they brought. I mean, my then wife, Adrienne Roy, and I were under contracts for 3 years at a time with work guaranteed and a month vacation bonus and, free medical insurance. So, things were a lot better than they'd been for a generation in comics, or 10 years earlier or so.
Wow, and I know, speaking to production people today, that the cost cutting that's going on right now is absolutely hitting the letterists and the colorists.
Oh yes, I mean I talked to a colorist friend of mine who was one of DC's top colorists, and he was doing color separations for Marvel's, like the reprint hardcovers, the Masterworks and such.
Okay.
And he was doing separations, which take like 5 hours a page or, the better part of a day to do a single page. And the rate dropped a while back from $20 a page to $15.
Wow.
And, that was for like 5 hours work. And, as I said, 20 years ago, I was getting just for paper coloring, $34 or $44 a page.
Crazy.
So yeah, it's and some of that is, of course, because books are selling a lot less, but they're also, of course, comic books are now $2.95 or $3.95 a piece. And
you bet.
When I got into the business, they were 20 cents each. I mean, when I started reading comics, they were 10 cents. But in 1974, DC Comics were still 20 cents a book.
That was my first year of buying, sir. I mean, I had 12-cent books bought for me when I was incredibly little, but about 72 or 73 is when I started. I remember the 20-cent comics being the first ones that I was buying with my own allowance and everything.
But I was lucky enough not only to get to work with the Kurt Swans and Julie Schwartzes and, Gil Kanes and such, but also with the new generation. I mean, I colored Justice League with Steve Englehart writing, and Adrian colored Teen Titans from the very first issue.
With Marvin George Perez, fantastic.
Mark Wolfman and George Perez and Len Wein editing. And she also colored Mike Grell's Warlord, which was one of her top colors back then.
Oh, man.
Of course, together we colored Crisis on Infinite Earths. But there were the Batman artists we work with, and just about everything once I left staff. I would color the covers solo, but generally, and I would do initially about 20 covers a month. But as a team, we did most of our work as a team.
Okay.
And where anything with her name, anything with my name, a third of the work at least would be hers, and sometimes 90% of, if the Batman books were hot, we'd work on getting the Batman books, done first, and then do the less hot books, regardless of whose name was on them.
Okay.
And we generally, because we'd been trained by Jack Adler in telling the story, and not just throwing colors around indiscriminately. I mean, as a colorist, our job was to focus the attention, to build the mood. There were formulas, and of course, the art is not making it look like formula, or not letting it all be formula. Mm-hmm. But the formula is what gets you by the pages, which make no sense, or you can't do anything with. But, so you can devote yourselves to the ones. But building the mood, telling the story. I would give it as an example with the Jack Adler, Saul Harrison School of Coloring. You see a lot of bright red fire engine, Superman cape, red chairs in the real world, poster chairs. Mm-hmm. But in a comic book, the chair in the background shouldn't be bright red unless there's $10 million hidden inside it, because it's not important to the story. It's something that should fit into the background. So the idea was to focus the attention on what's important, as a lighting person and a cinematographer would do in a film, and kill what's unimportant. I think that's one of the problems with comics now, as computer separations and better printing have allowed much more shading and much more rendering. At times, everything is so over-rendered that it's hard to see what's going on, and it may even become a little bit painful to read at times, taxing on the eyes. But our job was to simplify, to clarify, to try and create a mood, especially in a book like Batman or a mystery horror title. On the Shadow Strikes, which was one of my favorite books I did, with some wonderful artwork by the late Eduardo Barreto.
Yep.
That was a Baxter book, and that was, one of the books we came to do with better paper and better printing, offset printing. And the problem, since the Baxter paper was slicker than your normal comic book pulp paper, the ink tended to sit on top of it rather than be soaked in. And thus it tended to have a day-glow look on a lot of the Baxter books. And I felt a day-glow look would be wrong on the shadow. You didn't want something, coloring so bright it would poke your eyes out on the shadow.
Right, he worked in the hence the name. He worked in the darkness, absolutely.
Right. So what I did is I traded in the solid values of red, yellow, and blue, or magenta, yellow, and cyan, for 10% and 20% gray tones. And then I didn't color anything on that book over a 75% tone. And that gave it a bit more of a rotogravure look. Or it brought the intensity of the color down to something, more like a standard, newsprint comic.
Okay.
Instead of being a real bright, blue, it would be muted a bit. And I think it really worked. And as I said, I was going for a 1930s rotogravure printing look on it. There were. I also colored the Phantom, which was drawn by Luke McDonnell and written by Mark Verheiden, who, of course, went on to be the head writer and eventual producer on Smallville and Battlestar Galactica.
Yep, and Falling Skies, and I forget his current show that he's doing right now, but yeah, big TV name right now.
And he was another of the young talent in comics at that time.
Mm-hmm. That was like a 18th or 19th century or 18th century kind of pirate story, as I recall. It was a flashback to an earlier Phantom of pirate days. Or
well, actually, I think the more pirate-oriented ones were the miniseries drawn by Joe Orlando. But the Phantom, of course, is 450 years of history of 21 generations of the Phantom, and and there were, it was a great, exciting time. I mean, I remember I was assistant production manager, and I used to give the tours at DC. We didn't do many tours. They'd been a regular thing in the 60s, but when we had a VIP or someone, in, I would give the tours, when someone like Eddie Rabbitt, the Warner Brothers singer, or Mel Torme would come up.
Mel Torme, a comic fan.
Actually, he was a collector of G8 and aviation pulp magazines and Big Little books.
Outstanding, and of course your wheelhouse right there, so that's pretty cool.
And but one day in 1977, someone new was hired in association with the company, who had never read a comic book in his life and had never even seen a Superman TV show or cartoon show of Superman. And I was assigned as his liaison that day to help him learn who Superman was and to bring him around to the writers and editors and help them pick their brains, on the character. And we were both 25 years old at the time. His name was Christopher Reeve. And I think he did a pretty good job learning who Superman was.
So how do you indoctrinate Christopher Reeve into Superman mythos?
Well,
you've got a limited time.
He really wanted to talk to the writers and editors. I remember Marty Pasco, who was an orphan himself, saying, he had to be aware that Superman was an orphan. He also talked to Carrie Bates and Elliot Magan, I believe, and, of course, Julie Schwartz. But, I mean, he was really legitimately interested in the take of the people who dealt with him. And, I think that shows in his portrayal. And, of course, Christopher Reeve really came to realize and reteach us all how important Clark Kent was. George Reeves on the TV show had essentially played Clark Kent pretty much the same as Superman. And Christopher Reeve made us believe that you might be able to, know both of them and not realize they were the same person. Because he played Clark who's such a schlep who'd get his necktie caught in the ladies' room door and get stuck in the revolving doors and really made it believable. So that it was exciting to see that. And my wife, Adrienne Roy, who started as my assistant, and then when DC was desperate for a new colorist, Jack Adler asked if he could try Adrienne out. And with her third job, he called me into his office and closed the door and said, Adrienne's going to be the best colorist we have.
That's fantastic.
And I mean, very soon, she was the regular colorist on Superman, and then she picked up Batman, and she was coloring the Batman books and Teen Titans, and when Paul Levitz was an editor, she was coloring all 4 books he edited, and when Dick Giordano became, managing editor, he colored all 4 books. She colored all 4 books he colored. And she just instantly understood. She'd, done as a student her own stop-action animated film, and she had directed a college student remake of Tom Edison's 1910 Frankenstein film, which was then a lost film, and later she found the original treatment.
Wow.
And so she had a knowledge of storytelling, and she was a painter. And she just instinctively understood how to tell stories with color, and became very, very much in demand. And no one knew how big Teen Titans would become. It became DC's X-Men at that time. including Marv and Len and George Perez, expected it to run for more than 6 issues or so, because new DC titles tended to only run 6 titles or so at that 6 issues or so at that time.
Sure, this was post implosion, which I know was a couple years earlier. I've heard rumors. Forgive me for stopping you, but I'm curious about that specific time. I had heard rumors that Warner was considering really like, why do we need the comics anyway? We got the licenses for the Superman and Batman stuff that, they're still selling birthday cakes and bed sheets and stuff. And that it was Levitz that, kind of explained, no, you need kind of this intellectual property laboratory, putting it in today's context.
Well, that was probably a case. And I mean, for a number of years, DC became part of Warner, I think, research and development for the films.
Okay.
But that's very likely true with Paul. But I mean, there was a time when, we were informed that DC, I was informed that DC might be going all reprint. And,
wow.
There would have been maybe people, retouching the art to change the fashions and the hemlines on the women's dresses and such.
Crazy.
But
crazy.
The DC, there was some consideration of that, and I was informed because I was also told that I'd be one of the few people probably still on staff, because they would still want new coloring, to make it look modern as possible. But yeah, that's likely. But there were a lot of things that were considered. The decision was never made. It was a possibility. But yeah, there was a rough period in the comic book business. One of the amazing things, I say looking back, I mean, a few years ago, there were 300 staff employees at DC. There were, I think, 60 editors and assistant editors, 5 attorneys or so on staff. I mean, it's like, 5 or 6 floors of employees. And when I started at DC, there were about 32 people on staff, including the payroll department upstairs.
Wow.
And so there were about, 20 of us in editorial and production combined. When you consider that, that was a whole lot bigger than Marvel in the 60s, which had, a bullpen, which was really, Stan Lee, for some time Stan Lee and his girl Friday Flo Steinberg and Saul Brodsky and, then Roy Thomas. But,
Ramita.
He came actually, later.
Okay.
I mean, as art director, he was a freelancer, at that time initially.
Okay.
But we, we were a really small team, and everyone knew each other. And in some ways, I think it was way more fun than it has been lately, because everyone. There was a lot more variety in the work we did, simply because there were so few of us that we had to be jacks of all trades. I was a liaison between editorial and production. I loved that job, my job as assistant production manager, because every day was different, and I think in the 5 years I was assistant production manager, 5.5 years I was assistant production manager, I think Jack Adler, my boss, told me to do something probably 5 times, because he knew I was a self-starter and he trusted me to do what was needed. And I'd look and I'd see what was needed, and if there was if we needed to get covers out, I would paste up some covers. If we needed art corrections done, I'd take a book and do corrections in the morning. If there was a backup in the darkroom, I'd go into the, backup darkroom, and I'd shoot stats for a couple of hours, if that was what was holding the other people up. And then in the afternoons, I'd be checking proofs and coordinating the approval of proofs with the editors and such. So every day was different. And, I just really looked and saw what was needed and pitched in, and it was wonderful in that regard. And, of course, now, when you have 300 employees or something, you're a lot more compartmentalized in your duties.
I can imagine. What years were those 5 years in particular?
Well, I went on staff in July of 74, and then in July of 76, I became assistant production manager. And I always remember that because I came back from my honeymoon and I ran into a DC Comics employee at the Phil Sewing July 4th comic book convention. And we'd just come back from my honeymoon. And this DC Comics employee asked me if my job was affected by the shakeup in production. And I'd been away for 2 weeks and hadn't heard anything from production, and that's really not what you want to hear when you're just back from the honeymoon. But the shakeup was that Carl Gafford was moving to California, and I was going to be replacing him as assistant production manager, which and also getting a lot of his freelance the freelance coloring he'd been doing. So, within a few months, I was also the regular colorist on Justice League and Green Lantern. And, but as I said, it was an exciting time because you had this, excitement of the new and all these, young, enthusiastic, energetic people, working their dream jobs. And at the same time, you had, all these veterans and the people we idolized growing up who were still there to learn from. And at the same time, on the side, in the 70s, I'd become very good friends with Walter Gibson. I'd always been a huge Shadow fan. And I co-authored, I was brought in to write 6 chapters of the Shadow scrapbook. And by the way, I'm working on a revised and expanded edition of it now, which will be considered.
That's great to hear.
And,
excellent.
So, eventually I developed what could be a fatal problem working in comic books, which was gray hair. And everything was fine when I was 25 and the editors were 60, but when I was 45 and the editors were 25, it didn't necessarily work as well. And luckily, old-time radio came around. The funny thing was, for me, there was a life after comic books, but it was old-time radio and pulp fiction, which were things that had gone away before comic books. And I was very lucky. I wrote about 70 historical booklets for radio spirits and wrote when radio was, and got to write a couple of scripts that were narrated by Walter Cronkite.
Fantastic.
And
good for you, man. Wow.
And then, when that started fading away, and again, I was there at just the right time. I was there in a boom time in old-time radio with more product than ever before, and at a time when it was possible for me to make a very good living for a decade writing on old-time radio. And that's not really possible now, because at that time, you saw the Radio Spirits collections and the Great American Audio collections at Sam's Club and, Walmart and Target and Costco and such. And, of course, and also Barnes & Noble and Borders. And the big sales period was, the biggest was Father's Day, and the next biggest was Christmas.
Okay.
Because, people were buying old-time radio collections for fathers and grandfathers.
Certainly.
But that was 15 years ago.
Right.
And a lot of that generation has died off. So, there's still old-time radio, and, there's still, professional companies doing it. But it's not, it's not at the peak. I managed to be there at the peak.
Understood.
And then I was lucky enough to become the publisher of the Shadow and Doc Savage, and as of the books coming out next month, I will have published reprinted 150 Shadow novels.
Fantastic, man. And then, like you said, the Doc Savage license
right.
as well.
And I trust you've heard the news that it appears Shane Black's next film after Iron Man 3 is going to be Doc Savage.
Yeah.
For Sony Columbia.
I'm hopeful, but I have to be honest that I'm a little nervous as well, because I remember the Ron Ely film.
Well, the Ron Ely film, first off, was filmed as a pretty serious adventure film.
Yes.
Ron Ely talks about how there was a shakeup at Warner Brothers management, and the new regime purposely had the film edited to be camp because they didn't want a success that was had been put together by the previous team.
Oh, you hate when you hear that. Oh, man, so new regime demanded that they make it campy instead of being the straightforward adventure it should have been.
Right, and
crazy.
Or largely edited, within the music and such. But Shane Black has been a huge Pulp fan. He subscribed for a long time to the Spider reprints. I know was subscribing to them 10 years ago at least.
Okay.
Supposedly has all the Doc Savage paperbacks. Is a huge fan of Pulp Fiction and hero pulps. And I think if you look at his screenplay for Lethal Weapon and the verbal interplay between Danny Glover and Mel Gibson, I think he can write Ham and Monk without it being camp.
That's an interesting
I think he can do adult insulting banter and not have it come off, silly.
Okay, I understand.
And I think How to Treat Monk and Ham is one of the hardest things to do in Doc Savage, because it is kind of comic book characterization. It's pretty juvenile, but I think he could very likely, and he's a great, action screenwriter and director. I mean, he did the film that really resuscitated Robert Downey's career before Iron Man, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang.
Absolutely.
He wrote and directed.
Yep. I agree with all of that. I had this conversation with Matt Wagner years ago about Zorro, and it just kind of dovetailed into Sherlock Holmes, The Shadow, Batman, Superman, and how, especially superhero and pulp characters really do work best in that era in which they were created. Or created for. Modern day Zorro kind of falls apart because you really do need it to be in that period of California pre-statehood and, having the influence of Spain, having the alcalde and the various dons that, the landowners and that.
And Disney did it so well. The Disney Zorro TV series. Produced by Norman Foster, produced and directed by Norman Foster and starring Guy Williams. Is just so wonderfully done. And of course, the first season, the second unit director was Yakima Canutt. And you had, music composed and conducted by William Lava. It was just a superb production. And at a time when Superman and the Lone Ranger had budgets of $20,000 or $25,000 a show, the budget on Zorro was $75,000 a show, and it showed.
Wow.
It's the one show from my childhood that really stands up. And talking about pulp characters, Zorro is interesting because he's the only pulp character I can think of who has consistently been better, or who has generally been better, in media adaptations than in the original pulp stories.
Okay.
Johnson McCulley's original stories are not that great, but what especially Disney did, was just phenomenal with it.
I agree. I guess my concern is, and I want to hear not only in film, but really, you were there when DC was doing The Shadow. Now, as a kid, I thought that was a great 12 issues.
Well,
I don't know, as someone who's really studied the character, looking back, what you think of that?
I was a little bit disappointed in it, but I'll tell you some neat things about it. First off, when I came in, there were 2 issues scheduled to be printed, 7 and 8, and that was to be the end of it.
Okay.
It was to be canceled with number 8 for sales that weren't that great. And then the sales figures came in on Frank Robbins' first issues. And, the fans are so fond of Mike Kaluta, and Kaluta, of course, built his reputation and did a wonderful Shadow. But his Shadow may have been ahead of its time, because at that time, our audience was largely children still, and comic book readers as opposed to collectors and, diehard fans. And the comic book stores, were just barely starting at that time. And the direct sale market hadn't started yet. And Frank Robbins had much more of the Jack Kirby power. Leaping figures and blazing 45s and, Of course, he moved from the Shadow to the Invaders at Marvel, which was, working on Kirby characters.
Yep.
But sales jumped with Frank Robbins. And unfortunately, Robbins had left for Marvel. He did one last issue and got in an argument with Carmine.
Oh, wow.
And then E.R. Cruz came in, who I actually thought had the best, had a lot of the spotting of blacks and the action and power of Frank Robbins, and a lot of the mood of Kaluta. One thing Mike Uslan has brought up, which I was not aware. Mike Uslan was, by the way, one of the Woodchucks too. He was the general summer assistant for Saul Harrison and Carmine Infantino.
And quickly, for people who aren't hip, Mike Uslan, of course,
executive produced all the Batman movies going back to
there you go
one with Michael Keaton and
right, and was even, I guess, tangentially part of the team as well, of the Nolan team as well.
Well, he was still executive producer. I mean, not tangentially.
Right.
He was the one who, put the deals together for the Batman movies and has
there you go
produced all of them. And he's also, done a number of TV shows and other projects, and is executive producer of the planned Doc Savage movie. And if another Shadow movie gets done, it'll probably be, Mike Uslan too.
So was he? But did he do the Baldwin? Did he do the Baldwin film back in the 90s?
No, he did not.
Okay, go on. I'm sorry.
And but this was the we have a whole. Once again, that's another of the enthusiastic newcomers in comics at that time. We have I forget. What I recently learned from Mike Uslan, or actually read for the first time in his book, The Boy Who Loved Batman, and I hadn't known this, is that, and I've since confirmed it with Denny O'Neil, is that the Shadow was planned. DC had plans to bring to continue the Shadow as a black and white R-rated adult series.
Wow,
going for the savage tales of Marvel and the Warren market. But
sure, the black and white magazine market, absolutely, man.
And they felt that that was the proper format and the proper length of stories. And of course, Marvel did its best Shadow with the black and white, not Shadow, Doc Savage with the Doug Minch series, originally drawn by John Buscema, and then other artists.
I remember it well, absolutely.
And
Showcase collected those recently.
Yes. And so, but DC apparently had plans to continue the Shadow, but to, and of course, it ended up the Shadow's, next return to comics was with Howard Chaykin, in 1985.
Yes.
86, actually, I think it came out. Yeah, 86.
Yes, that's right.
With a more, adult
absolutely
take on it. And
yes.
And that was, I believe, DC's first Baxter-only comic book, or, direct sale-only comic book aimed at the fan market. So, it would have been interesting to see what Denny O'Neil and Mike Uslan, and I would assume probably E.R. Cruz would have done with the Shadow.
We did get that Marvel graphic novel a little bit after that, right?
The Hitler's Astrologer by Danny O'Neil, illustrated by Mike Kaluta and Russ Heath.
Yes.
And
what did you think of the Chaykin run, real fast?
I was not fond of it.
Okay.
I was a Shadow devotee. I kind of subscribe to Marv Wolfman's argument that new comics talent shouldn't kill off any character who, was created before they were born. And in the first pages, of course, of the first Chaykin issue, the Shadow's agents were killed off.
True.
I had serious, disagreements with the DC Doc Savage revival, which I didn't color the miniseries, but I colored the next one, because that had Doc Savage still young, and the five all old men who were walking around complaining that they were too old for adventures and whining all the time, and there didn't seem to be an understanding that that Doc Savage, how important the five and the chemistry and their relationship was.
Understood. It's a team book. It absolutely
right.
is a team.
And well, Stan Lee has said. I mean, it's really, the whole. So much of the Marvel thing, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, and even the Fantastic Four. You look at the insulting banter between Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm in the early Fantastic Fours is very much Monk and Ham. You look at the Fantastic Four without secret identities, headquartered on the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, with two of the aides, arguing and playfully putting each other down all the time. There's a lot of and a team led by the world's greatest scientist. There's a lot of Doc Savage in the Fantastic Four. There's, of course, a lot of Doc Savage in Superman, too. And, Absolutely. Of course, we haven't even gotten yet to how much of the shadow there is in Batman.
Absolutely.
Bill Finger in Jim Steranko's History of Comics was quoted as saying that his first Batman story was a takeoff on a shadow story. And when I was launching these, an article that Will Murray had done reminded me of that quote. He did an article on, pulp predecessors, of Batman, in I think Shadow number 6 or 7 of my reprints. And
okay.
I encountered that quote, and I asked Will if anyone had ever discovered which Shadow novel that was. And Will said no. And I became kind of obsessed with it. And one Saturday night, over the phone, my collection was in better, order than Will's, but we started comparing notes as to which one it couldn't be. And within 20 minutes, we found it. Or I found it, but, and recognized it, but it was based on, Will's suggestions. And and it turned out to be the first Shadow novel written by Theodore Tinsley, the first Shadow novel not written by Gibson after more than 100 Shadow novels.
Wow, which one?
It was one called Partners Apparel, and I reprinted it in our first annual Foreshadowing the Batman buy-in, which was number 9 of my Sanctum Books Shadow double novel reprints.
Still available now if
yes.
they go to your website?
Yeah.
Excellent. Very cool.
Of course, which I should mention, www.shadowsanctum.com.
Fantastic. We want to sell some books for you.
Yes, and people can also write me at orders at shadowsanctum.com.
Fantastic.
But basically, since then, Will has tracked down. I've tracked down a couple, but Will has tracked down a lot of of Shadow novels that inspired Batman stories, and it's a lot. It wasn't like that first one, because that first one, well, Bill Finger said the first Batman story was inspired by a Shadow story. It was an all-out adaptation, scene for scene, character for character, death trap for death trap. There's literally nothing in the first Batman comic book story, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, in Detective Comics 27, that was not lifted from the Shadow, from Partners Apparel, except the name Batman and the costume.
Crazy.
And in fact, in the scene where Batman first appears on the roof in costume to apprehend the burglars, in the Shadow novel, the Shadow is surrounded by bats, and the Shadow himself is described as bat-like. But it's scene for scene. I mean, there is nothing. I'm restraining myself when I call it an unauthorized adaptation. It is, and of course, the strange thing was, at that very same time, DC Comics was suing Fox over Will Eisner's Wonder Man as being, because he flew even though he wore a red costume instead of a blue, and didn't have a, otherworld origin. DC shut down Wonder Man.
Yes.
And yet Wonder Man was just, another flying superhero, costume superhero. Whereas Batman was not only lifted, inspired by the Shadow, but the first story was lifted entirely from a shadow novel. So
what about the Black Bat? I don't mean to interrupt you, but and I'm really glad that pulp character. I find that interesting, and as a novice, I don't know, and I know it's kind of murky, but someone who studied the pulps and comics as you have, that was a character that seemed to debut around the same time as Batman.
I think it debuted, within a month of Batman. And
after Batman?
After, but I mean, it clearly they were developed independently. The first novel was written. Turned in December, the previous December.
Okay,
and
December 13th.
Before the first Batman story was written and drawn, as far as we know. And however, the character was actually called the Tiger in the novel, and that was changed to the Black Bat. It was called the Tiger because of the tiger-like scars on his face. Now, another thing is the Black Bat. Well, and that Black Bat had the scalloped gloves before Batman.
Okay.
Very similar costume. And the origin of the Black Bat was actually lifted for a later Batman villain. District Attorney Tony Quinn has acid thrown in his face. And his face is scarred, and of course District Attorney Harvey Kent, later Harvey Dent, became Two-Face that way.
Harvey Kent in the strip, right? The comic strip.
Well, no, in his very first Golden Age appearance.
Excuse me. All right, very good, because I remember reading the reprint of the Batman Daily Strip that showed a Two-Face origin, and I thought that was Harvey Kent as well, but I appreciate the correction. There you go. And that's why I'm talking to you.
But, it was a matter of coincidence, and a lawsuit was averted. Because Whit Ellsworth, who had been a writer and may have even written some of the Black Bat stories, had come over to DC as managing editor, replacing Vin Sullivan. And, he was able, to make nice. And, of course, the odd thing is DC also managed to lift some very important things from the thrilling Ned Pine's thrilling pulp line, which has Leo Margulies as managing editor, because he raided the staff right around that time, and several of their editors came over to DC.
Who were some of these people?
Mort Weisinger and Jack Schiff, and I think Bernie Breslauer, I think his name was. But Mort Weisinger, of course, was brought in initially to oversee to some degree the Superman books, but primarily as the Batman editor. And then when he was drafted, Jack Schiff came in for World War II. Jack Schiff came in and to fill in. And then when Mort Weisinger came back, he became Batman editor again, and Schiff became managing editor of the line. And then eventually, Mort Weisinger in the 50s became, the full-time Superman editor.
Replacing Whit Ellsworth, who became more involved with the TV series, is that correct?
Although Mort Weisinger was also story editor on the George Reeves TV series. But, yeah, cool. Whit Ellsworth moved out to Hollywood. And, and that was, of course, one of the things that made the Superman TV show so wonderful. It was actually, the stories were being supervised. George Reeves was an employee of DC Comics. The cast members were working for DC Comics.
Right. Remind people of that the whole real production was funded by National Comics then, DC's name back then.
As had, of course, the radio show. And one of the things, because I have a perspective on DC Comics history that goes beyond comic books. I mean, I feel that Superman became the dominant comic book superhero not because he was the first superhero in comics, but because he was the first to move beyond comic books. Because at a time when, Action Comics was selling 800,000 copies an issue, and Superman quarterly and then bi-monthly was selling 1.2 million copies an issue. the Superman radio show had 5.5 million listeners a day. And the newspaper strip was appearing daily in 30 million newspapers. And then you have the Fleischer cartoons, the Paramount Fleischer cartoons. Actually, I call the Fleischer cartoons, but only the first 8 were Fleischer. The remaining 8 were after the Fleischers were deposed. Those are Paramount Famous Studio cartoons. Same staff, same team, but the Fleischer brothers had been deposed.
Right.
And, of course, the first 8 of those, Bud Collyer and the radio cast were also, heard, doing the voices.
Yep.
So...
Joan Alexander as Lois, as I recall.
Right. Jackson Beck doing some incidental voices.
Jackson Beck, Bluto.
Yeah.
From Popeye.
Right. Jackson was a very dear friend of mine, and I was amazed. When he died, I was actually mentioned in his will, which totally floored me. And Jackson wanted me to have his childhood celebrity scrapbooks and showbiz scrapbooks that he'd put together as a kid.
Fantastic.
And I directed Jackson in dozens of old-time radio recreations at the annual Friends of Old-Time Radio convention. And,
fantastic.
And I did a series of, I did the last 5 episodes of Superman versus the Atom Man. And I had in my cast Jackson Beck narrating and as Beanie, and I had Mason Adams recreating his role as the Atom Man, the Nazi spy with kryptonite flowing through his veins.
Wow, Mason Adams from the Lou Grant TV series.
Right, and he was, of course, Pepper Young on radio and Pepper Young's Family. And
crazy.
He played Shrevey in a single episode of The Shadow on radio, but he was the Atom Man on Superman. And
unbelievable.
He just had a ball playing the Atom Man again, because Mason Adams didn't get that many, chances to play radioactive Nazi spies. The kryptonite flowing through their veins. But he had a lot of fun doing that.
We're going to pause there for part 1 with Anthony Tollin, but don't worry, in just an hour or so, I'm going to be uploading part 2 and finish the conversation, get more into the pulp heroes and Anthony's extensive knowledge of the pulp era. And I love this stuff, as you know. I'm a big fan. We also get into a lot more old-time radio talk, and it was a pleasure talking to Anthony and having this really great long conversation. So look for part 2 coming up in just a few minutes right here on the Word Balloon feed if you don't see it already. So enjoy that, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And we got great conversations coming up as the march to Christmas will continue. Word Balloon doesn't take a break like other shows and other media does during the holidays. I know you're lonely. I know you might be traveling or really just have a moment to yourself and might want some entertainment. That's why Word Balloon still generates programming right up to the new year and beyond. So we're closing out 2022 with new stuff and great old conversations as well to keep you warm. My God, it's 14 degrees as I'm talking to you right now in Chicago. Winter has come, even though we still have technically 3 more days of fall. But that's all right. I'm here to keep you company and enjoy yourself as we wrap things up for 2022. So enjoy part 2 of Anthony Tollin, just coming up in a few minutes. Until then, thanks for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions. Copyright 2022. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.